Compensators versus porting is a big question these days, so we're going to attempt to answer it, but it's probably bigger than you're realizing, and we're going to get into that and declare winners and losers. Welcome back to the Humble Marksman channel. I'm David, and this is the Staccato XC, and this is the Masterpiece Arms DS9 with V6 porting. And YouTube, you're asked to enforce policies that you don't understand, but both of these guns come from their respective builders as they are shown here. Now, something that's really popular in people who like to post pictures of guns on Instagram these days is some kind of muzzle device or porting put onto guns. Now, what happens is most people are taking guns that are not compensated or ported and they're modifying them. These guns come from the factory the way that they're shown here. But there's something about these guns that's a little bit different. Like the Staccato is actually built around being a compensated gun, whereas the Masterpiece Arms is just taking an existing design and throwing some V6 ports in it, as you can see there. So we're going to try and answer which one of these technologies is more effective in mitigating muzzle climb, but before we do that, I need to hit you with some bro science. So the way that these systems work, and it's basically the same in both, is the cartridge is in the chamber, the hammer falls, and the cartridge ignites. The powder starts to burn, pushing the projectile down the barrel, converting gunpowder into gas. The projectile reaches the end of the barrel, and the gas comes out behind it into the expansion chamber, where the gas begins to expand. It hits the baffle at the front of the compensator and is redirected up so that the bullet is the only thing roughly leaving the muzzle and not the bullet and the gas. So what exits the muzzle is called the ejecta, and it's not just the projectile, it's also the projectile, the gas, and the unburned powder. Porting works in a similar way where as the bullet moves down the chamber, gas escapes to either side and it helps fight the lift going onto it. Because if you think about what recoil and muzzle climb actually is, it's the slide moving all the way to the rear of the recoil stroke and then bottoming out so hard that it actually turns your wrist a little bit based on the force. Then the spring that is now in compression extends back out and the muzzle comes back down. If the spring pressure is too high, the muzzle will actually dip down past the point of liftoff, and then you'll get a little wobble at the end of the recoil stroke. So that's what's going on with recoil. That is how the compensators kind of work. So how do you test for that? Well, I did exactly what you'd probably do, and I stood back just past 10 yards or so, and I had both guns, and I fired at the targets, firing doubles, just to gauge how the central tendency of the groupings would be. That is the Staccato XC. The cold weather just kind of, all right, there is the DS9 with V6 ports. It was the beneficiary of the Staccato going first for sure, but it was very, very easy to shoot. Now, what I observed to be true is that the Staccato actually was more stable than the Masterpiece Arms. Both of them were amazing to shoot. It's just the Masterpiece Arms was not as stable as the Staccato. Now, as we discussed, the Staccato is built from the ground up to be a compensated firearm, so I would expect it to perform a little bit better. The dot didn't climb as high, it was more stable in the window, and that reflected in the hits that I got on target. Now, most people would stop there, but that's not bro science-y enough, because I know you love bro science. So I took my high-speed cameras and I filmed these bad boys in high-speed video. So at about 2,000 frames per second, the gun's shooting looked like this. That's not bro science-y enough either. So I used my Microsoft Paint skills in my editing software and I measured the angle of climb to see if the Staccato was not lifting as high in recoil as the DS9. And what I found is that the Staccato doesn't lift as high in recoil, but it is almost no different, honestly. It's slightly better than what the DS9 is doing, but that doesn't answer the question then. Why is the Staccato XC, and you can see it in the slow motion video, why is it more stable than the DS9? So that obviously leaves me with more questions, and the shooting alone isn't answering it. So I decided to start taking the guns apart since a gun is a system, and maybe the answer lied in how the guns are actually constructed. But before we go there, I do want to thank my Patreon and local supporters, guys. If you want to check out something for free, sign up for Locals. It is totally free. There will be some free posts, there will be some locked posts that are only for supporters, but Locals is a community centered on free speech and doesn't have the same censorship issues that YouTube tends to have, so it's very cool. You should check it out. Also, if you happen to find yourself on the Optics Planet page, don't use code HUMM. It doesn't do absolutely anything. So the first thing we should do when we're taking the guns apart is to understand the springing that goes into them, because the recoil spring is very, very important. As discussed, when the gun goes back into battery, the force enacted by the recoil spring is going to affect how much the gun wobbles. Staccato XC, because it's built from the ground up to be compensated, only comes with a 7-pound recoil spring. That's right, that's a very light recoil spring. Meanwhile, the Masterpiece Arms has a 9-pound recoil spring, so 2 pounds heavier. And that would explain a little bit more of the wobble that we observe under the high speed, but I don't think that's everything. So bare bones, the DS9 has nearly a 3-ounce premium in weight over the Staccato XC. So why is the Staccato flatter if the heavier gun is supposed to be more stable? Well, where you carry the weight is important. Now, in pistols, there's 2 types of mass. There is the non-reciprocating mass, or the fixed mass, and there's the bits that move. What you want is you want the moving bits to be lighter than the fixed bits. So if you have heavier fixed bits and lighter moving bits, especially on a compensated gun. Now that said, that only applies if you've got some kind of muzzle device or compensator or porting on your slide. If you lighten your slide but don't have some sort of muzzle device, what you're going to see is the gun is going to become more violent to shoot. Starting with the grips and the frames, despite only having a polymer frame, the frame on the Staccato is only about an ounce lighter than the frame and grip on the DS9. So the DS9 has a 1 ounce heavier frame and grip. I weighed the steel guide rods they both have, and they weigh about the same, with the guide rod for the DS9 weighing 0.1 ounce more, but that's basically the same. So then I weighed the barrels, and that's where things get interesting, because the Staccato is not the same at all as the DS9, because it has what's called an island barrel. You can see the male-female relationship between the front of the barrel and the slide right there. That is because the barrel has the compensator milled out of the steel bar stock that makes the barrel up ultimately. So the barrel for the Staccato was over an ounce heavier than the barrel for the DS9. Just right there in the compensator, the frame has drawn level to the fixed bits on the DS9, which means, if you're mathing along at home, that the slide is where all of the weight difference is between these two guns. As I can kind of demonstrate for you by holding the guns right here, that's right, you can see that the DS9 slide is a full 5-inch slide, whereas the Staccato slide is actually a commander length slide that has a chunk out of it to mate up with the sight block. So the slide on the DS9 weighs over 2.5 ounces more than the slide on the Staccato. And all of a sudden I understood why the DS9 was not quite as stable as the Staccato. DS9 has more mass going back and forth as you shoot the gun, and it's being propelled by a heavier weight spring. And on top of that, the ports are much smaller than the hole on the compensator. So that's basically where we land, is that the Staccato has an extra ounce right at the tip of the muzzle, which helps it stay flatter, because, you know, all the fixed mass has inertia, so when the gun wants to lift, you've got an extra ounce right at the most advantaged spot on the gun to resist the gun lifting out of recoil, plus whatever force the gas is exerting at the end of the muzzle. So that's kind of the lesson I walked away with when comparing these two guns. They're both awesome, by the way. I wouldn't have my feelings hurt with either one of these guns. I prefer the Staccato, but the Masterpiece Arms DS9 is an absolute terror of a gun. It's absolutely wonderful. And the lesson is that if you're going to build something to use gas to actively reduce recoil, you have to optimize the system for doing so. The Staccato is more optimized out of the box than the DS9 in the fact that it has a lighter weight slide, a heavier barrel, and it has more space to vent gas straight up. And that's kind of the point I'd like to build up, is that the people who are just taking the guns and doing whatever they do to them, you have to realize that the whole gun is a system. You have to visit the recoil spring, you have to visit the hammer spring, you have to figure out the slide cuts. So if the slide weight is down on top of having the ports or the compensator introduced, you balance the spring weight appropriate to the ammunition. If there's a hammer spring, you pay attention to that as well. You optimize the system to behave as one. So I guess that's kind of the analogy. To simply just put some sort of recoil mitigation something onto it without optimizing the whole gun is basically the car equivalent of going to AutoZone and buying a high performance muffler and not actually optimizing the entire exhaust system. It might help some, but it doesn't help as much as it could if the whole system was optimized. So if you found value in that, please subscribe and consider following me on Locals. As always, I appreciate you guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.